On April 26, 1986, in the early hours of the morning, specifically 1:26:58, all that was heard in a small corner of the Vyshhorod Rayon sector of the greater Kiev Oblast was possibly an explosion. Those that were up late would have maybe seen a blue light piercing the sky from a hole in the forest. This beam of light was the aftermath of a horrific accident that would become one of the worst man-made disasters in history. This was the Chernobyl disaster. That night, Chernobyl's reactor 4 was running a safety test when they found a high amount of energy coming from the reactor. So to control the surge, the control rods were all inserted to the reactor. The only problem was that the tips of these rods were made of graphite, a moderator of neutron flux. The fission created as the AZ5 button was hit cracked the graphite tips a third way through the reactor, increasing fission and thus creating more steam, creating higher amounts of pressure in reactor 4, cutting fuel lines from getting through to the reactor and overheating, eventually leading to a 2,000-ton reactor to be sent through the roof, leaving it in the air for 10 seconds before landing back down, flipped like a coin. A secondary explosion that went off after the other one, as fast as you could clap, sent the irradiated graphite out and around the reactor, on the roof, on the ground, anywhere close to the reactor, while also spilling the radiation from the fuel, uranium-235 dioxide, into northern Ukraine and southern Belarus. The first fatality of the disaster was when Valery Kodemchuk was walking through a concrete hallway next to reactor 4. As the explosion happened, the wall supposedly collapsed onto the worker and, as was said, became the first fatality of Chernobyl. Some of the higher-ups at Chernobyl did not believe that an RBMK reactor had exploded, but others could easily tell that something had gone wrong at number 4. The graphite with pieces of the reactor, when exposed to the cold, springy air, caught fire, spreading more fallout than if all of them just tumbled out without setting on fire. Apparently, sparks flew out of the reactor onto the roof. Several workers went to get a better view of what had just occurred. One, Alexander Yevchenko, described the previously talked about blue light as beautiful. Initially, there were several theories on what caused the explosion. One was that it was caused by combustion of the hydrogen by the water or steam in the reactor, which could have been caused by the steam zirconium reaction, or that the red-hot graphite reacting with the steam, which caused carbon oxide and hydrogen. A third reaction hypothesis was made by Konstantin Chechedov, was that the explosion was caused by the endless release of neutrons caused a thermal explosion, which in turn was caused by complete cooling water loss. Fire control. A safety violation was that the roof of the reactor was made out of a material called bitumen, whichever way you want to say it, which is a very flammable substance of the parts of the reactor that had been flung out caused 5 fires on the roof of reactor 3. For the sake of the plant, it was imperative to douse the fires and to protect the insides of reactor 3. Yuri Bagdasarov wanted to turn off the entire reactor, but Nikolai Fomin, chief engineer, would not allow it to be turned off. The operators were given by the staff of the plant respirators and potassium iodide tablets and were forced to continue to operate until 5 o'clock in the morning, when Bagdasarov made his own decision and shut down the reactor. Soon after the 2 explosions, firefighters arrived at the reactor. In charge was Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik. They were not told the true amount of radiation of the crater that used to be reactor 4. We didn't know it was the reactor. No one had told us. A fire engine driver, Grigory Kmel, they had told. They arrived around 1:45 to 1:50. Some went up to the top to extinguish the roof and were never seen again by other fighters. It's thought that the fires were extinguished by a mix of helis dumping into the reactor around 11 million pounds of sand, lead, and boron and clay. None of this helped because it never reached the core. An estimated 600 Soviet pilots risked high amounts of radiation in an attempt to hurry the process of shutting off the radioactive core. One firefighter said that the radiation tasted like metal and pins, needles in his face. This is similar to Louis Slosson's experience with the Manhattan Project. The main explosion sent fuel and others fission products into the air with isotopes like strontium-90, cesium-137, iodine-131, and other radionuclides into the air. The locals of Pripyat and Chernobyl could see the radioactive cloud during the night. Radiation levels. In the worst parts of the complex, the radioactivity was 5.6 roentgens per hour, 20,000 roentgens per hour. A lethal amount of radiation is 500 roentgens over 5 hours. So most workers near reactor 4 with no protection basically died in less than a minute. A problem with the accident is that the only two things that could read high amounts of roentgens, one was buried in some of the rubble and the other failed when turned on. The only ones they could use to read the levels only read up to 0.001 roentgens per second, while, as stated earlier, the true levels were much higher because of this incident. Within an incident, the chief, Alexander Akimov, through the reactor would still be in one piece. Thought the reactor would still be in one piece. The pieces of graphite and reactor fuel out and around the reactor was ignored completely. Another dosimeter brought in around 4:30 was ignored as being thought of being defective. Akimov stayed in the building until the morning. He would tell some of his crew to pump water into the reactor. Most of the reactor crew, including Akimov himself, died due to radiation in weeks. Evacuation. One of the nearby cities, Pripyat, was not immediately evacuated at 1:23 a.m. when the reactor went off. 1:23 a.m. when the reactor exploded. They were doing what they would normally do at the time of the day, when within hours people had metallic tastes on their tongues, pounding headaches, and painful fits of vomits and coughing. The Ukrainian government did not get any information on this situation with the reactor because the plant was mainly run by Muscovite authorities. Valentina, chairwoman of the Presidium of Verkhovna Rada of the Ukrainian SSR at the time, recalls around 9 o'clock having a call with the acting Minister of Internal Affairs, Vasil Durdinets, where only at the end did he say there had been a fire at Chernobyl. When asked how the people were doing, he replied, "Some are celebrating a wedding, others are gardening, and some are fishing in the nearby river." She then called Vladimir Shcherbetsky, General Secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, who anticipated a delegation of the State Commission headed by Boris Tribuna, a deputy chairman, to the Council of Ministers of USSR, which was established later that day to start an investigation on the accident, led by Valery Legasov, first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. Legasov's crew arrived at the scene of the disaster the evening of April 26th. By the time they arrived, 2 were dead and 52 were hospitalized. They aptly decided to evac the populi of Pripyat 36 hours after the initial explosion, originally thinking it would be good after 3 days, but changed later to be permanent. 11 o'clock, April 27th, a convoy of buses ready to huddle in the Pripyat citizens and evacuate the greater area. People started slotting into the buses around 2 p.m. The PA system around the town and on the buses started playing the following evacuation message. For the attention of the residents of Pripyat, the city council informs you that due to the accident at Chernobyl power station in the city of Pripyat, the radioactive conditions in the vicinity are deteriorating. The Communist Party, its officials, and the armed forces are taking necessary steps to combat this. Nevertheless, with the view to keep people as safe and healthy as possible, the children being top priority, we need to temporarily evacuate the citizens of the nearest towns of Kiev region. For these reasons, starting from 27th April 1986, 14 o'clock, each apartment block will be able to have a bus at its disposal, supervised by the police and the city officials. It is highly advisable to take your documents, some vital personal belongings, and a certain amount of food, just in case with you. The senior executives of public and industrial facilities of the city has decided on the list of employees needed to stay in Pripyat to maintain these facilities in a good working order. All the houses will be guarded by the police during the evacuation period. Comrades leaving your residences temporarily, please make sure you have turned off the lights, electrical equipment, and water, and shut the windows. Please keep calm and orderly in the process of this short-term evacuation. As is the usual, the residents of Pripyat were told to only bring necessities. By 3 p.m., 53,000 citizens were moved around the Kiev region. The next day, talks were made on evacuating a 10-kilometer area, which was later widened to 30. Thus, the exclusion zone was made and is bigger than the original 30 kilometers, with the random hotspots of radioactivity. 135,000 evacuees decided to move between 1986 and 2000, made the number triple to 350,000. Official acknowledgement. As explained earlier, 36 hours after the Chernobyl disaster, the surrounding area was evacuated when the Soviet Union finally publicly acknowledged the situation with that area of Ukraine. On the 28th, the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, alarms were set off by radiation levels over 1,000 kilometers away. Workers there reported to the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority, which determined the levels to originate elsewhere. The USSR was contacted by Sweden to ask if there had been an incident within the Soviet Union. At first denying anything happened before Sweden was going to raise an alert with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, that they finally admitted about Chernobyl. They said that it was only a minor incident, but after evacuating 100,000 people, did the truth get out to the international community? At 9:02 p.m. on the 28th, a 20-second announcement was made on the Vremya program. This was the first official time the Soviet Union admitted about a nuclear accident at a plant. The TASS, Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union, then discussed the 3 Mile Islands accident and other American accidents, which Sergei Shmemin of the New York Times was an example of the common Soviet whataboutism. The mention of a commission was what really showed how bad Chernobyl's situation was. The radios in the Soviet Union were changed to classical music, which normally was followed by the announcement of a tragedy, which at the same time, ABC News released their report on Chernobyl. Shevchenko, in the early hours of the same morning, visited the area and talked to medical staff and people hopeful that soon they could return home, had to later stop at a radiological checkpoint in Vilcha, one of the first of these to be set up at the border of the zone. Moscow notified Ukraine that there should be no reason to postpone the 1st of May International Workers' Day celebrations in the capital Kiev, including the annual parade of on the 30th of April, through a meeting of the political bureaus of the Central Committee of the CPSU took place to discuss how the celebration should go down. That went till 6 p.m., sorted out that the normal 3.5 to 4 hour celebration should be shortened to under 2 hours. Some of the buildings in Pripyat were kept open to be used by workers at the plant. These include the Jupiter factory, which was a factory on the outskirts which made cassette recorders and other components for home appliances, which was closed in 1996. The somewhat famous Azure swimming pool, used by the liquidators for recreational purposes during the cleanup, which was closed in 1998. 2 floors of bubbler pools beneath the reactor served as a large water reservoir for the emergency cooling pumps and as a pressure suppression system capable of condensing steam just in case a small steam pipe broke. The 3rd floor above them served as a steam corridor under the reactor. If a pipe broke, the steam was meant to be led down to the pools. These basement floors were flooded with firefighting water and leaks from water pipes to the reactor. The 1200-degree radioactive fuel started to burn through the floor of the reactor and mix with the melted concrete to create a semi-liquid material known as corium, which could be said as basically radioactive lava. The fear that was that the corium would melt to the water and the steam produced would contaminate an even wider area of the even wider area or create another explosion. One of the primary objectives now, after evacuating the city, would be to drain the corridors of water, which seemingly was later found to not be needed because pieces of the corium would fall onto the water and turn into a brown ceramic pumice, which, because of the density, allowed the pumice to float. The commission would leak out the water through sluice pipes. The valves controlling it, though, was in a flooded subterranean annex adjacent to the building. Volunteers with respirators to keep radioactive aerosols out and diving suits with dosimeters in hand entered the now radioactive knee-deep water. These volunteers were workers at the plant that knew where the valves were. Alexei Ananenko and Valery Bezpalov, accompanied by a shift supervisor, Boris Baranov. All three of them would later be awarded with the Order for Courage by the Ukrainian president in 2018. Most news broadcasters said that 3 men died days after, when really they lived on for years and continued to work in the industry. As of last year, Bezpalov is still alive. Baranov died of heart failure in 2005, age 65, and we don't know what happened to the other dude. Once the bubbler pools were opened by the men, fire brigade pumps emptied the basement. This was not finished till the 8th of May, when 20,000 tons of water were pumped out. The other concern the commission had was that the melted core was going to go through the ground and contaminate the groundwater. To stop it, they would try and freeze the earth under the building, which would stabilize the foundations as an added bonus. Using equipment for oil well drilling, they would inject liquid nitrogen. They would start on the 4th of May. It was thought that around 25 tons of dry ice would have to be inserted to keep the ground frozen. Subway builders and miners were hired to make room for cooling system, which was a coil-shaped set of pipes with a graphite concrete sandwich or core catcher would be similarly adapted into other later reactor designs. This tunnel was found redundant after reports told that the fuel had stopped melting and had cooled on the ground floor and had gone through 3 floors, so the tunnel would be filled with concrete to strengthen the foundation. Cleanup. In the months following, it was found that 100 tons of debris on the roof would have to be cleared for a sarcophagus. 60 remote-controlled robots would be used, to most of them failing due to the radiation, killing the electronics and battery. Legasov would later say in Moscow, "We learned that the robots are not the great remedy for everything. Where there was a very high radiation, the robot ceased to be a robot, the electronics quit working. So the worst parts of the roof would be shoveled off by a group of volunteers from the military called liquidators in heavy protective gear, also called biorobots. Due to radiation on the roof, the time limit on the roof for those men was 40 to 90 seconds. So 20 seconds so 40 seconds to a minute 30 on that roof. Even though the soldiers were meant to do this once, they had to do this task 5 to 6 times. Only 10% of the debris cleared was actually done by robots. The rest was from around 5,000 liquidators who absorbed, on average, just over 25 roentgens of radiation each, or 250 microsieverts. The design of the first sarcophagus was thought up on the 20th of May 1986, and then construction was begun between June to late November, while also creating a thick wall to protect the operators of Reactor 3. During the construction of the sarcophagus, a scientific team, as part of an investigation called Complex Expedition, re-entered Reactor 4 to locate and contain fuel that could cause another explosion. They would collect cold pieces of graphite while the reactor itself was still releasing heat. They would monitor the reactor's radiation levels by drilling holes in the side and putting detector tubes in the holes. Of course, with doing a task like this so soon after the explosion, this crew was exposed to high rates of radiation through the air and dust. In December of 86, 6 months after the first investigation, a group of men found with a camera pushed in from around a corner a mass more than 2 meters wide had formed in Reactor 4's basement. This mass was dubbed the Elephant's Foot. For the wrinkled appearance, it had been made of melted sand, concrete, and a large amount of reactor fuel that had escaped the reactor. Concrete beneath the reactor floor was steaming hot and had been breached with now solidified lava and spectacular unknown crystalline formations dubbed Chernobylite. The crews sent down there that year said that there was a low, if not no chance of another explosion happening. Area cleanup. An effort to clean up the greater area took 7 months to complete. The official reasoning for such a quick start to the cleanup was the land must be populated again and brought back to cultivation, which within 15 months, 75% of the land was under cultivation. They wished to forestall panic relating to nuclear energy and even to restart the Chernobyl power station, although many of the emergency vehicles used would be buried in trenches. Most of the vehicles were not buried, including the helis that tried to slow the reaction in the reactor parked in a field in the Chernobyl area. Scavengers have removed working yet radioactive components. So the vehicles of these vehicles, liquidators had the whole situation pretty bad. Wrongly informed, little protection. Most of these men exceeded healthy radiation limits. They were first washed with a substance called barda, a sticky polymerizing fluid to entrap irradiated dust. I'm going to have to edit a lot of this out and redo lines. Highlighted notes. The blue light piercing the sky. The blue light seen above the reactor that night of the explosion may have been a phenomenon where radiation excites the atoms in the air, and to go to a lower state, the atoms give off some of the radiation of their own, photons of light. The forest. There's a forest within the exclusion zone known as the Red Forest because the radiation that hit the trees in it and all the other effects during the disaster caused the trees to be frozen in time, so for years the trees looked like it was always spring. Valery Kuremchuk, the as stated previously, first casualty of Chernobyl. The part I want to touch on with this man is that there is now a memorial to him in the concrete hallway near Unit 4, east of the pump hall where he died, and in 2008 was given the third-degree Order of Courage by the Ukrainian president. Louis Slotin. Some of you who have watched Kyle Hill may already know who Louis Slotin is, the second man to lead the criticality tests after Harry Daghlian on a third core that was meant for another nuclear bomb before Japan surrendered. These tests killed both Daghlian and Slotin. The object they tested on would come to be known as the Demon Core. This would later be dissolved and spread around the US's nuclear catalog. Both 20,000 roentgens per hour and elephant's foot. Another thing made known by Kyle Hill and the elephant's foot, a large mass is the elephant's foot. A large mass in the basement of Reactor 4. Some said that when they tried to get a sample of it, they had to either shoot or smash with the butt of an AK. This is probably one of the biggest sources of radiation currently in Chernobyl. That wasn't well known, and in the photo being used here is a middle quote from the man who collected it. Now to continue